The View by Robert Aickman. As the boat cast off from the landing stage and began to rise and fall in the yellow waters of the Mersey, Carfax recalled the last of England. The wide, swift river and the tall buildings on both banks, the Liver Building, the Cunard offices, and the huge constructions, mysterious in purpose, which sprang up like indestructible molehills when the Mersey Tunnel forced its way from shore to shore, provided a scale, lacking in an open seascape, by which to set off the smallness of the vessel. Before him, the urgent, dangerous looking stream could be seen suddenly to end and be replaced by the empty ocean, a question mark in the mind. New Brighton Tower, much larger apparently than any southern equivalent, stood at the end of the river, like the upright of a gateway, the other side of which was concealed from Carfax by the superstructure of the boat. In that building, he seemed to remember, Granville Bantock had contended with popular audiences and the dead weight of past misery which drips like Mersey rain upon the mind of all artists. Carfax was not the man to live on the beach, like Whitman. The very weather of Liverpool discouraged such a thought, or even like Gauguin, the manner of whose death could please no one, on a warm island. But he suspected that his own not unsuccessful career in the Foreign Office had already so sobered and discolored his imagination that his music and painting, products now of spare time only, would be unlikely to catch that great joy of emancipation which alone, he asserted, made life and art worthy of attention. Carfax always saw all good in terms of emancipation, all beauty, all duty. Others had seen the vision, but the slave selves of their past had intervened, making the gorgeous tawdry, the building in strange materials as rapidly failing in beauty, use, and esteem as the human body itself. The very dampness of the air does, however, on occasion lend a wonderful depth of color to the landscape, Carfax had read in his guidebook. The glass through which he glimpsed life as he sailed that morning imparted this rainbow watery transient clarity of color, while compressing and encircling with a boundless edge of uncertainty. Hence, the last of England. Minor masterpiece, he felt, not so much of doomed adventure and hope to be blighted, as of escape unsanguine, but compelled. Through that unexpected consortium of rain, fog, and wind which is the characteristic climate of Merseyside, Carfax watched the 15-foot liver birds on top of the great building recede into the driving cloud which is their element, mythical, yet, in the case of at least one specimen, to be seen stuffed in a Liverpool public building, these creatures ride the seldom abating storm like human hopes. He remembered that 15 years ago he had hastened third class to Liverpool in pursuit of a beautiful vaudeville actress then appearing in that city at the Shakespeare. Passion, he seemed to recall, was then something unable to be left with his cheap synthetic suitcase in the station cloakroom. The boat was beginning to roll to an extent which many of his neighbors seemed to think disagreeable, and Carfax wondered whether unhappiness or nausea tended the faster to produce the other. By the time they were nearing the bar light, terminus of the long double series of buoys which leads vessels from Liverpool towards the fathomless submarine canyon lying concealed north and south down the middle of the Irish Sea, Carfax had discovered the bow of the boat to be uninhabitably gale-swept, and also lacking in seats. Astern he found the best place which offered, and, sinking into his overcoat, watched the crew as the light ship was passed heave overboard the fish on the end of a line which, turning in the water, records on a dial the distance traveled. It was cold and damp, but not intolerable, or at least not physically so. Carfax wondered what a real storm was like, being swept overboard by a wave, seeing a whole life as a vision to be clutched lest worst befall, watching wet clothes being dried before an almost soaked out fire, or the boredom of life in an open boat with strangers, ship's biscuit accompanying horrible corned beef as a diet, the lack of interest among friends who would have to hear the story for unavoidable social and practical reasons. As England receded, however, into a memory of ill-painted buildings and a line of unhappy faces taken off their guard on the underground railways, Carfax, to his surprise, began to notice signs suggesting that his fellow voyagers considered the weather to be improving. A speck of glowing ash blew on his face from a newly lighted cigarette. Deck chairs began to be dragged clatteringly over his feet from the heat. From across the boat, a hot smell reached him of fish and chips and greasy Liverpool Echo. A portable wireless began to thrum and pound, its operator varying popular tunes of the type Carfax himself had composed for small sums of money in earlier days, with violent unaimed thrusts into the ether, explorations generally ending in an echo of lowest common denominator fundamentalism. She has no idea how plain she is, and of course you can't tell her, observed a conspicuously unattractive woman of about 45 to a replica of herself. Communism gives the workers something to work for, vehemently asserted a man in a raincoat. His wispy, colorless hair appeared on his prematurely obtruding scalp line, like the last vegetation in the Dust Bowl. So I said I'd give it to her if she promised to have it dyed green, remarked a round matron to her bored and miserable-looking husband. If you bring in the orders, I'll look after production. You can leave that to me. I know how to handle the ruddy government. In the end, I had to drag the clothes off her, and she tried to turn quite nasty. The speaker looked away from the other man and laughed gloatingly before resuming his former confidential mutter. There's no hope of the world but a big revival of real Christianity, said the serious-minded, rather important-looking man. He was apparently addressing a large popular audience. Real Christianity, he said again, with emphasis. Look well into purpose, said a woman of 30 to her offspring, in the tone of one anxious to guide rather than dominate the child's formative years. Soon the bell sounded for first luncheon, and the group of passengers round Carfax began to break up, some going below, others opening ill-made packages and trying to shield the contents from dispersal in the gusty wind. The gulls, which would have followed the boat round the world were she aiming that far, drew nearer and flew more urgently over the deck. Carfax recalled that fragment of the great and beautiful Sappho, according to which the souls of the dead become white gulls in slow flight before a high cliff in the bright sun. He recalled how he had walked one sunny day along Freshwater Down, and thought his own soul took flight and drifted warm and lazy and forever. Wandering along those white and removed cliffs, he had remembered Wagner's inscription on a copy of the Pastoral Symphony presented to Baron von Kudel. This day thou shalt be with me in paradise. His drifting thoughts returned to the gulls shrieking and bickering above him, fierce and free and white and light and doomed. A pathetic fallacy, he thought. He was seated facing directly astern with his back against the cabinwork. Sentimentality. He squirmed in his seat and his eyes settled upon his shoes, their high polish discolored by Liverpool weather. "What's wrong with that?" inquired a voice. A woman had risen from the seat round the corner of the cabin, or before he had distantly observed her reading, and was standing before him. The book was held upside down in her hand. Carfax recognized it as a volume in the collected translations of Voltaire. "I'm feeling hungry," she remarked in a tone so matter-of-fact and commonplace that Carfax ever afterwards wondered whether she had indeed uttered the earlier surprising question, also whether he himself had indeed spoken his thought aloud. "Could you possibly remember me till I come back?" She removed a stout oilskin coat, placing it on her seat. She was wearing a jacket and trousers and a simple white shirt. Her head was bare, and the fingers holding the book were long and white. "I shan't forget you," said Carfax, not quite certain whether the situation required him to rise to his feet. Moreover, was not the other's tone a little peremptory? "Thank you for your memory." She disappeared. Men are divided into those who know they find women too attractive for their peace of mind or happiness to be long continued, and those who know they would be happier if only they would come to some sort of terms with the intransigent and rather trivial opposite sex. Carfax, who, upon medical advice, was virtually in flight, came, it would be gathered, into the former category. Finished with women, almost with the world, for he had very nearly decided to resign his position at the Foreign Office, and afflicted for several months now with a loss of appetite so complete and protracted that he was beginning to fear it would be permanent. He reflected with weary bitterness upon his folly and weakness as, ignoring his promise about the seat, he descended the steps into the ship's dining saloon. She was seated at a long table by herself in the half-filled saloon. Grease-spotted stewards sidled rapidly up and down, with small portions of half-cold mutton. She had removed her jacket, and her smooth light hair lay upon the shoulders of her close-fitting shirt, giving an effect at once remote and elegant. She greeted the entrance of Carfax and his request to be allowed to join her, without the slightest feeling for or against becoming apparent to him. Neither felt impelled to admit cognizance of the several quite empty tables near them, but their conversation throughout the meal was more desultory and broken by longer, more unstrained pauses than is usual between strangers. They consumed a bottle of claret, and, when coffee came, were quiet and smiling. She produced some Turkish cigarettes in a rather large gold case. "Do you know the island very well?" inquired Carfax. "Better than anybody," she replied, unemphatically. "I wonder if you could recommend a good hotel. I'm told there are no visitors at this time of year, so that one can get in anywhere. I thought I'd have a look round before settling where to stay, but perhaps you could advise me." "Advice is always dangerous." Propelled by the steady breeze of agreeable impulse, Carfax became confidential, as a man does upon his first luncheon with a woman who pleases him. "I've been very ill." The breeze of impulse slackened suddenly, then resumed. "I've been ordered a long holiday. My doctor suggested the island." "That's what comes of living too long among strangers." He looked up, but her concern seemed real. If you've been ill, I think you'd really better come and stay at Fleet. Then, after a pause too brief for Carfax to reply, she continued, The weather in the island's irresponsible at this time of the year, and there's nothing whatever you can do about it. If you've been ill, you won't want to spend all your time in a hotel lounge. You'd become neurotic, like the rest. Carfax winced. So stay with me instead. Fleet is a big house, and you'll never see me if you don't want to. Carfax's thoughts were racing, and his spine muscles were stiff and painful. Normally a man of second, third, and fourth thoughts, he, like all habitual vacillators, varied vacillation with occasional gross precipitancy. When decision is required, reflection avails only a few. He accepted quietly and gracefully. He paid the bill, and they ascended. She drew on her heavy oilskin coat again, and they went forward. As they neared the island, she stood beside him in the bows of the boat, naming to him the mountains, the castles, the steep-sided narrow creeks, the mansions of the great and rich gleaming like palaces of glass in the now bright sun. Round the island the water was clear and deep, she said, the air clean and strong. She stood there like a pre-Homeric goddess, or Greta Garbo in Anna Christie, her oilskin glistening, her hair streaming, her eyes shining, her voice soft but unfailingly distinct, unforgettable. Grief and Carfax began unobserved to shrink and slumber. Upon the quay, among the mail vans and relatives and few loitering holidaymakers, an expensive car awaited them, attended by a plain but efficient young woman in chauffeur's uniform who drove like the wind but with the reliability which can only come from a vocation for the work. As they sped through the streets of the capital and beneath the park walls of the mansions encircling it, Carfax felt himself succumbing to the rapture of swift but secure motion. Suddenly, in a minute or two at the most, like great doors opening, his mind relaxed. He became aware of himself for the first time in many months or years. He lost himself, and entrancing happiness chilled him like the creeping bursting of dawn. Do you recall Johnson's definition of happiness? Driving briskly in a post-chaise with a pretty woman alongside. Johnson was afraid, like all mortals. Are you never afraid? Oh, yes, she sighed. I am not immortal. Are you quite sure you're not? She looked at him. Immortals have no names, or names that no man or woman may utter. Have you a name? I have 3 names, but you may not utter them. You will hate them all. They are hideous, commonplace names of schoolgirls and young brides, and elderly, lonely pensioners, and pure women, and books, godparents' names, goodly names. Useful names, which people in shops can spell. I will not tell you what they are, but I will write them down for you. She opened the volume of Voltaire, and beneath the legend Finis wrote her names on the tailpiece. The car had been ascending a mountain road, swift as a motor race. Her pencil tailed off down the page as they bumped over the uneven surface. It dropped to the floor. A strong, invisible wind poured through the right-hand window as the car reached the ridge. It ruffled Carfax's hair as he stooped to recover her pencil. For me, he said, looking away from her and out at the treeless, houseless, sea-bound plateau, you are someone quite different. I shall call you Ariel. She could hardly have heard him as he gazed into the unceasing wind flooding through the open window of her car. Is the island uninhabited? He asked after 10 more minutes without sign of smoke or chimney. Or rather, do all the islanders live in the capital? Only visitors live in the capital, she answered, smiling. Then, suddenly, she pointed through the window to the sky. Look, geese! She cried. He could see nothing, nor did the wind or the sound of the car permit of the possibility that the distinctive sound of geese in flight could reach his ears. But Ariel appeared transported with joy. How wonderful! The geese have waited to welcome me, she cried. To welcome us, she added, with apology light and heartwarming in her tone. She seized Carfax's arm. The geese are the true aboriginals of the island, she said in mock seriousness. But the visitors come to paint them and catalog them and protect them. So not many come back now. The white settlers set traps for the native people of Tasmania and soon had them exterminated, remarked Carfax. But the white settlers themselves then fell into the traps, she replied softly. That is why the visitors have to huddle together in the capital. That is why the rest of the island seems to you uninhabited. You see? Not a building in sight. But as she spoke, the hills opened and Carfax saw Fleet for the first time. He found the house hard to place architecturally. Like Inigo Jones's Parliament House in Edinburgh, it was probably older than it looked, possibly much older, for Carfax recollected that he had no knowledge of island buildings. On the other hand, it might have been a supremely accomplished modern pastiche, weathered to an aspect of misleading age by the island storms. But a pastiche of what? Of a most beautiful small mansion of the 18th century, Carfax decided. Perhaps the early 18th century. In any case, such speculation was subordinated to wonder at the skill with which the lovely house had been placed in hiding from the world. Carfax had visited Compton Wynyates and marveled there at the faintly similar effect to that now before him, but the concealment of Fleet was supreme and final, a wonder of imagination and ingenuity, an echo from the deep unconscious. How glorious to live there, Carfax cried with a schoolboy enthusiasm he had never noticed in himself before. She smiled serenely at him and began to push stray corners of her shirt into the top of her trousers, preparatory to alighting. I've never seen anything on anyone half so lovely. The car sped up a beautifully firm, even, yellow drive, the gravel rustling sensuously beneath the wheels. Flat, tight lawns called to the spirit on either side, and Carfax visualized peacocks. Above the front door, something had once been carved, a date, a monogram, a crest, a rebus, but crumbling age or crumbling modern stonemasonry, one or the other, had rendered it now unintelligible. The door was opened by a maid in an elegant gray silk dress. Ariel was momentarily stretching herself upon the step, her oilskin coat a heap at her feet. She was still smiling her small, serene smile. She looked a wonderful, quiet happiness. Welcome to Fleet, she said, something intonation at once masking and mocking the conventionality of the words. Welcome home, ma'am, said the gray-clad maid. Carfax's first impression was that the house was full of people. He then perceived that the effect came from several mirrors, which reflected and counter reflected their three figures. These mirrors were not many, but the skillful placing of them gave an effect of magnitude and mystery, apparently aided by the construction of the house. Apartments of the most various shapes and sizes led into one another in all directions, without doors, and as no two apartments seemed to be decorated alike, the mirrors set up a chiaroscuro of reflections coexistent with, but apparently independent of, the rich and bewildering chiaroscuro of the apartments themselves. Carfax found he could seldom certainly identify the origin of any particular reflection, and was perpetually troubled by the apparent existence of two separate houses within the space rightly occupied by one. Each room, considered by itself, was perfectly proportioned and exquisitely decorated, but when much of the whole was seen at once, the mind tended slightly to waver and check. The staircase, which rose before him, passed from side to side of its well, dividing and reuniting at frequent alternate landings, the perfect miniature of a grand staircase on which a duchess receives her guests. Carfax followed the grey-clad maid to his room. As he ascended, he noticed that the constructional principle followed on the ground floor was repeated on the floors above, the same interconnecting, undoored rooms, each room different in size, shape, and color, the same mirrors. The effect was slightly vertiginous. Carfax thought of the three-dimensional chess his divinity tutor had tried to interest him in at Oxford. Also, he noticed the stair carpet. A long yellow snake extended its length down the center of the wide, deep green. The coils of the snake varied in relation to their background, and Carfax, who tended to be obsessive, found himself watching for particular variations to repeat themselves. His room seemed to be on the top floor of the house, but he failed to detect a single indisputable repetition in the pattern of the carpet. At the top of the house, the rooms were no longer interconnected and without doors, but the disposition of rooms and corridors was still mysterious and complicated. The room he had been given was unexpectedly conventional. A white paneled door was set in red-blue wallpaper. A big, old-fashioned brass bedstead, rather French and ornate, set the tone of the furniture. Heavy, formally expensive, never perhaps in the best of taste, very unlike the rest of the house, he thought. The grey-clad maid set down his bag, remarked, "Tea will be downstairs when you are ready," and departed. Carfax crossed to the window and looked out. Outside was the same empty moorland of the drive and the car, running down to the same clear sea. As they had approached the house, Carfax had considered it to lie in a large dell almost surrounded by fairly high, steep hills. The beautiful, wide, empty view now stretched before him was intoxicating and magnificent, but he found himself completely at a loss to explain whence had come his former strong impression that the house lay uniquely concealed from the world. He knelt upon the floor to look in his bag for his field glasses, and as he did so, came into that conscious relationship with the pattern and texture of the carpet, which begins only with close physical proximity. The carpet, though pleasantly deep-piled, had not, during the brief time he had been in the room, seemed to him otherwise remarkable. But now he noticed that the not unusual pattern appeared, like the snake on the stairs, nowhere to repeat itself. He groped in his mind for the explanation, and before long it came to him that both carpets were possibly pieces of very much larger carpets. Of very large carpets indeed, he quickly realized. Reassured by this hypothesis, which related the carpets to the sum total of his life's experience, he briefly examined the view with his strong field glasses. There was not a house, not a figure, Not a road, not a pylon, not even a hedged field, only the ancient sea, the wine-like air. Wagner's words to Baron von Kudel returned to him. This clear, sunny emptiness was what his mind most needed. Deeply content, he put away the field glasses and descended to tea. The grey-clad maid was waiting in the hall and took him to a small, square drawing room where Ariel lay extended on a sofa, a tea tray by her side. The room appeared to be in an angle of the house, for there were windows in the centers of two adjoining walls, through which Carfax noticed the prospect consisted entirely of the near enveloping hills. "What a beautiful house!" Carfax exclaimed warmly over his bread and butter. "But you must find it difficult to keep up in these days." "We do not have to pay British taxes on the island," she replied, "and everything is much cheaper and better and more abundant." "Even domestic servants? Forgive my curiosity. It is only that I am deeply impressed with the beauty of your house. There are no beautiful houses in England now, only ruins, mental homes, and government offices." "My servants have always been with me," she answered. "I do not think they are dissatisfied." "I am quite certain they have no reason to be. This place is paradise, absolute paradise. But people tell me that servants want the pictures nowadays, and there's always the question of what used to be called followers. You seem very isolated here, but I suppose you have lots of visitors, and they bring servants of their own?" "The people here are not like the English, you know." She poured him a second cup of tea. "I have few visitors, but people here have interests of their own and never feel bored." "Few visitors in this huge house?" I visualized the whole place crowded with them. It all seems in such perfect order, as if every room were awaiting an occupant in the next hour or so, besides you yourself. "Yes." Her tone had no flavor of mockery. "You hardly strike one as living in sequestered solitude on a remote island." "I have never said solitude. After all, you yourself are here." "I'm being foolish. It is because I am so very unused to such dreams coming true as you and your house and my being here." "That, I think, is because you fail to draw the essential distinction. I do draw it. You live surrounded by the claims of other people, to your labor when they call it peace, your life when they call it war, to your celibacy when they call you a bachelor, your body when they call you a husband. They tell you where you shall live, what you shall do, and what thoughts are dangerous. Does not some modern Frenchman, exhausted by it all, and very naturally, say, 'Hell is other people'? But here there are no other people, therefore no war, no marriage, no government orders, and only such work as you choose and like, and nature herself requires you to do. Here a distinction is drawn. I am surrounded only by my friends, who are not like other people." "Am I, then, so unlike other people?" Carfax asked, in the schoolboy naivety new come upon him, which seemed so pleasant to him. "You are in flight from them," she exclaimed, smiling. Shortly afterwards, she referred briefly to the delights of the house. A carefully selected library, a well-stocked music room with 2 pianos, a small studio on the roof, a formal garden with a pool. "And, of course," she added, "there's always the island itself. You can spend a long time exploring that. All your life, in fact. Because the island's ways are always changing. When nature's advertising agents say that in books about beauty spots they are, of course, trying to conceal what they regard as her frightful sameness and dullness. But here, things are very different. The island is never the same, and never repeats itself. Or if it does, the pattern is too large for one mortal to comprehend, interrupted Carfax, thinking of something else. Or one lifetime, perhaps. No, I do not think it ever repeats itself, she answered, musing. Always there are variations, but of course, she added, the man in us looks rather for the pattern such as it is, the woman for the variations. She smiled again. But the immediate point is that you won't be seeing much of me during the day, so I do hope you'll find things to do. We are quiet here, but I hope not dull. Eagerly he reassured her about both these hopes. Carfax, who found in her movements a grace he had vainly sought elsewhere, watched her as she rose from the sofa and crossed to the door. She entranced him, so that only a corner of his eye and a fragment of his attention engaged themselves with the figure of what appeared to be a huge and burly man, passing first one window and then the other, as presumably he walked round the corner of the house. Ariel said nothing, and Carfax, as stated, was entranced by her. He spent the evening drawing in the garden. The spring sun shone, and the surrounding hills protected him from the wind. Immediately he entered the garden, his attention had been seized by a certain aspect of these hills, a large landscape of a force and significance utterly unprecedented in his experience, clamored through his brain to be released onto paper or canvas. Without going further, he started work, his swiftly moving pencil leaving behind it a line of astonishing power and certainty. It would be a somber work. In a few hours, Carfax had been so far emancipated as to be producing once more, and at long last, a somber work. Even Ariel passed almost from his consciousness, as drawing followed drawing, and he detached the pages of his block. His pencil traveled as if held by planchette. Tomorrow he would start the final version, the masterpiece. He worked until the gathering cold and damp reminded him that the year was yet young, and the island not 1,000 miles from England. To his astonishment, she appeared for dinner in the costume, though simplified, of an Elizabethan man, dressed in black, and with her white shirt left open at the neck to show her whiter skin. She might have been an actress about to play Hamlet, a Bernhard or a Laverne, were it not that her smooth golden hair hanging on her shoulders made not only her sex, but in some way also her authenticity apparent at a first glance. The long black stockings showed off her lovely legs and ensured that every small delightful grace of movement appeared to the greatest advantage. Carfax asked one question. "Why do not all women dress like you?" he exclaimed softly, "to awaken wonder and love." "My friends do," she answered simply, offering him an exquisite little glass. The small dining room was oval, with a ceiling which, though probably flat, was painted after the manner of Biagio Rebecca to appear steeply concave. As they sat at each end of a small oval table in fine satin wood, the gray-clad maid, now changed into evening black, perfectly served the perfect courses. After dinner they went up to the music-room, and for hour upon hour played to each other, or played duets, or played simultaneously upon the two pianos. The maid, at intervals, brought them coffee and cubes of rahat lakum, placing the trays on the colored table between them. A fire which had been lighted so illuminated the room as to make lamp and candles almost superfluous, especially as both players seemed so well to know the music. "Who is that bust over the mantelpiece?" asked Carfax. "I have no idea. Absolutely no idea," she replied. "He just goes with the house. He's part of the house." There were long pauses in their playing, as they talked eagerly and softly of the wonders and beauties of music, the hardships and frustrations and irreparable disappointments of the musician. Outside all was still except for an occasional wind which rattled and echoed in flue and window frame. There was no clock, and the hours passed, faded, and were lost. Carfax at last stopped playing and crossed to where she sat at the other piano. She had started to play what she said was an air of the island, arranged by myself. It curled and dripped through the thickly curtained silence. It seemed without meaning. Carfax's hands fell upon her black-covered shoulders. "Oh, Ariel," he said, "Ariel, I love you with all my heart and soul." She continued playing the rather thin, even silly little air. The melody accompanied her reply, spoken slowly and with pauses while she went on playing. She spoke while she softly played, some lines of verse. "Like the sweet apple which reddens upon the topmost bough, a top on the topmost twig, which the pluckers forgot somehow. Forgot it not, nay, but got it not, for none could get it." A few more bars, and she stopped. Rising a little wearily, she crossed to the small table and, going through the motion of pouring from the coffee pot, demonstrated its exhaustion. She made an indescribable little motion, indicative, it might be, of the bankruptcy, also of poesy. "It must be late," she said, smiling her steady smile. "We had better go to bed. We had better go to bed." When Carfax returned to his own room in the morning, he found it flooded with sunshine and swept, to the point of discomfort, by the breeze through the open window. The previous evening upon his return from the garden he had found the shutters and blinds drawn against the oncoming night, so that it was not until now that the contrast once more struck him between the view from his window and the view from outside the house. Now, again seeing the open moorland spread before him, he began to feel an uneasy wonder at the absence, in the view, of those compelling hills which were to be the main feature of his picture. He wondered also at the unwonted lack of method which had accompanied his inattention to the problem while he had been in the garden the day before, but the problem was at once so enormous and, when compared with the other happenings of the previous 20 hours, so small and unimportant, that the mind tended somewhat to reel, at once baffled and bored. Carfax continued, none the less, to stand staring out of the window, half naked and shivering slightly in the draughts which forced their way round the edges of the now closed sashes. He resolved at breakfast lightly to besiege the beloved Ariel with some very reasonable questions. One inquiry answered itself, however, at least in part, for not only did she appear dressed for riding, in breeches and boots, but soon remarked that he would not be seeing her again until the evening. Her attitude, affectionate rather than amorous, seemed in no way influenced by the occurrences of the night, but Carfax's initial disappointment was soon modified by an uprush of feeling, already increasing steadily and rapidly, that whatever she did was the best possible thing to be done, at least from his point of view, the thing most in his own interest. Her doings were mainly mysterious, but seemed to provide him, as well no doubt as her, with odd but complete gratification. Now he would have to get on with his picture. He would be able to paint, knowing she would return. Wonderful foreknowledge. Her daytime activity, taking her from him, about which he had been intermittently speculating, appeared to be riding. It sufficed. "I was wondering," he said, "why the very nice room you have given me is so different in style and furnishing from all the other rooms I have seen in the house. From your own, for instance." "The house has been built and rebuilt several times," she answered politely, but without displaying much interest in the matter, "even on several different sites, and occupied, of course, by many different people. I expect these are the reasons." I thought perhaps my room is in the style of decoration you reserve for your male guests, he continued, the presence all the time of this thought in his mind, and his consequent eagerness to express it, impeding his full immediate awareness of her answer. No, I draw no decorative distinction between the sexes, my darling, she replied in the same even tone of slightly patient commonplace. By now, however, something strange in the terms of her earlier answer had passed the resistance necessarily strong in any human mind to such strangeness, and had in part entered Carfax's consciousness. You talk the most sweet nonsense, dearest Ariel, he said, and nonsense with a lovely strangeness about it. Lovely nonsense. A very ancient said that all beauty must have something of strangeness, she replied, again with her serene smile. Like your carpets, he interjected quickly. How did you get a stair carpet which is different on every step from every other step? Is it part of a very huge carpet, or was it specifically made to a design of your own? Esprit d'escalier, she replied, gently smiling. Esprit d'escalier. The answer you cannot make, the pattern you cannot complete, till afterwards it suddenly comes to you, when it is too late. Will it be too late when I know the real answers to my questions? He asked. You must have noticed it is always too late when questions are answered, and hopes fulfilled, and sacrifices made, and murder done, because it is always later than you think. The gray-clad maid brought in a large porcelain bowl heaped with fruit. They ate for a while, in the silence of lovers. Later she rang for the dishes to be removed. Don't get painter's cramp or lead poisoning, my darling, she said, as they stood alone in the hall. I look forward so much to seeing you alive and well tonight. Emotion swept through him, and he embraced her passionately. She opened the front door. Outside stood a black horse, beautifully accoutred, the bridle held by the efficient young woman who had driven the car on the previous day. Ariel mounted, smiled at him, and rode swiftly away, the horse's hooves clattering excitedly down the spotless gravel of the drive. Carfax's gaze followed her out of sight. Then, noticing that the efficient young woman seemed to have gone about her business, he proceeded to go about his. Progress with the wonderful painting proved disappointing. Carfax found himself intermittently re-troubled by the problem of the view. Several times he left his easel and, returning to the house, climbed the serpent staircase to his room for further cogitation and research. Though his knowledge of the technique of orientation was hazy, it seemed clear enough that his room faced south, also that the south front of the house was at his back as he painted. But looking up from the little terrace where his easel stood, he was quite unable either to determine which was the window he had just looked out of, or to perceive how any window could possibly offer that wonderful, airy panorama. Nor when he looked out from his bedroom could he, owing to the configuration of the house and ground, see his easel, and he had noticed when below that the three parts of the garden, corresponding to the three fronts of the house which did not contain the front door, seemed oddly alike in plan and planting, perhaps identical. In the end, he resorted to the familiar device of hanging his towel from his bedroom window, first saturating it with water from his ewer to warrant the absurd procedure in the eyes of any inquisitive cleaner or bedmaker, also tumbling his bed anew, as he thought matters over, in his eagerness for the aspects of the wholly normal. But when he had descended to the garden, he found the soaking object a small, heavy heap on the ground, and the appropriate window as impossible as ever to detect by any index of open or closed sashes. Irritably, he ascended the staircase again, his fifth transit since Ariel's departure. Passing once more, he noticed, as he had done on each previous occasion, the gray-clad maid, who seemed always so much more in evidence than any other member of the domestic staff. Back in his room, fear rose for the first time to his consciousness as, at the casual glance he had resolved upon, he at once fancied that the view had changed. Sick shivering gripped him as his eyes stared without blinking or moving at a small building, a whitewashed cottage of the type a fisherman might be supposed to occupy, which stood at the edge of the distant cliff where Carfax was so certain no building had stood before. No building had stood, in fact, less than 10 minutes ago. His whole body was shaking as he sank into a chair, and he picked up a sheet of some newspaper he had used as packing for a pair of shoes. In the attempt to steady himself, he read through the first item his eye lighted upon. The paper shook so much that reading itself was slow and labored. It was the report of our racing correspondent upon happenings at Plumpton the day before, now more than a week ago. To Carfax it was all warmth and reassurance, like the aftermath of a bilious attack in school days, 20 years before. He recovered, looked again, felt no fear at all, and decided he had been mistaken. The cottage was still there, but he must have failed to notice it, through concentration on the wider view. He descended once more passing the gray-clad maid, now industriously polishing a suit of armor mounted on the first-floor landing. Something, necessarily something very slight in the proportions of the armor, seemed to him in some way familiar. A flood of feeling swept through him for Ariel, who, he at once realized, owing to a lover's inexactitude in such matters, momentarily seemed to him of just that size, and, absurdly enough, in some sense, shape and build. Several times already since meeting her he had caught delightful shades and echoes of her loved form and presence, where no such things could be except for the infatuate. He returned to the garden and resolutely began to paint. The notion of further experiments, even of the smallest enquiry, was swept clean from his mind. His tired nerves automatically threw off the slightest trace of conscious anxiety about the view, the only disturbing element in the period of blissful happiness he was now entering upon. Or perhaps very nearly the only disturbing element, for another minor mischief began almost at once to suggest itself. The nearly miraculous concept for his picture had completely disintegrated. Before and after the excellent luncheon the gray-clad maid had provided for him in a little square study well suited to meals taken alone, he struggled and searched to recover what was lost, to produce even a passably good painting. Only daubs and smears and lightning zigzags resulted. A corner of his mind seemed at once to offer the suggestion that in some incomprehensible way, by forcing his thoughts so thoroughly from the mystery of the view, he had injured his capacity to paint. Did his imagination in some way have to embrace everything or nothing? He had heard no sound of Ariel's return, but was interrupted by her, returned also to her black Elizabethan costume, as he scratched and fought with lost inspiration. As on the previous evening, night was rapidly descending, and he noticed that Ariel was shivering slightly in the sudden chill of the spring evening. It was an enchanting sight. Stretching out his hand, he touched her body between the edges of her deeply open white shirt. "I love you, Ariel," he said, "but I shall never be a great painter." He indicated the day's several failures. "I think the secret," she replied, kissing him, "is to get it down quickly, immediately as you see it, when you see it. Don't stop till you've got it all down." "I wonder how you know. You're perfectly right. Yesterday—" "That's just it," she said. "Yesterday. And today, everything's different. Things only exist as long as you see them. And we are all of us nothing
but the sum of our moods. Do your moods change very much? He asked. Everything changes all the time, very fast. I'm no exception, I'm glad to say. Only the dead fear change. I'm alive, my dear, really very warm and alive. How long will it be before you change about me? Oh, the slightly drawn out ejaculation was enigmatic. Shall we go in to dinner? He took her arm as a man takes a woman in to dinner. From his other hand hung the day's failures, slightly damp with dew or mist. Every now and then he looked out of his bedroom window, and every now and then a new, small, rather distant building seemed to have reappeared. One quiet night hour, when he awoke without reason while Ariel lay unconscious in his arms, he felt himself thinking the ridiculous thought, I'm glad I don't have to sleep in that room. His eye wandered round the warmly curtained walls of Ariel's chamber, the ornate cabinets full of her clothes, the silk-covered furniture, all muffled in darkness save for the patchy starlight from the large opened window, the dimly glimpsed scene, the unique remote creature warm in his arms, composed the utmost possible tranquillity and joy. He forgot about the view in deep surrender to his own released unconscious. By day, after that first day he had seen the first house, his fears were swamped and scattered in sun and wind. But, despite her brief return more than once in conversation to the theme of change, he made no reference to the matter when talking to Ariel, did not risk another of those so natural interrogatives she so lightly made to seem so heavy and unnecessary. But one morning, when he looked at the view for the first time that day, he noticed something nearer the house than the white and lately multicolored buildings on the rather distant cliff edge. At first it seemed as though a big megalith, a rocky pillar of large circumference for a pillar but medium height, had appeared about midway between the sea and the house. At a second glance, however, what had looked like a rock or a work of masonry was seen by Carfax to be a huge, motionless man, immobile and staring before him as if he were indeed a rock or statue, and a man, moreover, whom Carfax at once identified, the man who had walked round the corner of the house during that first afternoon in the angle drawing-room with Ariel. To Carfax it seemed as though all that was fearful concentrated in that enormous figure, unmoving but living, unmistakable though too distant for the clothes or much of the features to be clearly made out, and, as on a past morning, a shudder rose through his body from the foundations of his existence. The mechanism of protection in his mind was now, however, working vastly better than on the earlier occasion, and association with Ariel had released 1,000 springs of compensating happiness in his whole being. Almost at once, therefore, he in great part recovered and was able to go down to breakfast, which Ariel, to his considerable annoyance, apparently never wished to take accompanied by him in bed, without very much embarrassment manifesting in his aspect. Nonetheless, another question was unavoidable. One of the island gods, she answered. Or so they say. Ariel, he said urgently, his nerves once again momentarily overmastering him. Please, tell me, what do these things mean? I am sorry to be so obvious, but I'm a little frightened, dear Ariel. What am I to do? Why does the view from my window change every day? My darling love. She had risen and seated herself beside him, drawing up a chair. Her arms were round him, her whole nature pouring out in kindness. You must remember you've been very ill. You mustn't worry about life. You can't stop things changing. It's useless to try. You mustn't try too much. You remember how upset you were about that picture? The comforting, irrelevant commonplaces made his agitation seem childish and absurd, a neurotic's infantilism. Only the commonplace is really comforting, Ariel. Only children and unhappy people, who are like children, distinguish the commonplace from the exceptional. Under the common thing, the hidden grace. Now, you are getting better. You are beginning to see within the commonplace, the exceptional, to find the exceptional becoming quite commonplace. You have been so long among strangers, my love. But have I been as ill as all that? If things are really so different from what they've always seemed to me, I must have been mad. Mad for years. Quite possibly, my dear, she replied. When you live entirely among madmen, it is difficult to know how sane you are. But I should surely be mad now if I didn't wonder about some of the things that have happened since I've been here. Things I can't understand or find out about. Aren't you happy? I should never before have thought such happiness was possible, at least for me. And it is not that I used to think I knew very much. I used to try to follow Goethe's advice. I tried to worry only about the things I had decided were within the capacity of the mind, one's own mind, or perhaps the best mind, that has yet been born, sets the limit of truth. It is truth, in fact. Don't you think, Ariel? He gazed at her anxiously. Così esse vi pare. That is the only truth, and very dull it is, except perhaps as breakfast chat between people in love. She rose and resumed eating. Metaphysics exist only as the food or the substitute for love. Perhaps it is that the things my mind can grasp here are rather different things from the things it could grasp in England, he went on hesitantly. In England you would have felt guilty for loving me, or would be eating a little instead of a lot of butter for breakfast. So things are rather different, she answered lightly. There would be no point in your leaving England if there weren't any different at all. You do know that the view from my bedroom window changes every day, and sometimes during the day, he asked desperately. It changes and you change with it, my dear. It is your illness which makes you want everything to stay always the same. You are getting better now. Quite fast. I can never be perfectly happy, dearest Ariel, until I know why the view from my window changes all the time, and why it is a different view from all the other rooms I have been in, and why... a lot of other things. Why, Ariel? Why? He was pale and anxious. If you love me and know the answers, please tell me. Real fear for him seemed to appear in her face for the first time. Once more she abandoned her breakfast and stared at him for a moment. I don't know the answers, my dear, she said. I don't even understand the questions completely. It only occurs to me that if you were perfectly happy, that too would change. And you would change also, and would cease to find it perfect happiness. We can think or do. What else is there? Except that when you and I think and do together, there is happiness for a while. I fear if we ask too much, we shall lose everything. I am afraid your questions, when we are so happy together. Some measure of acceptance began once more to creep over him. Ariel, he said after a long pause, will you please not ride today? Will you spend the day with me? I shall not ride today, she answered. Love, and not a little fear, held them in perfect sympathy. Rising, she left the oval room. Shortly she reappeared, having changed into a striped silk dress and high-heeled shoes. They passed the day doing very little. Late in the afternoon she offered him another room, which he accepted. He had once moved his few possessions. It was a handsomely decorated apartment, warm and luxurious, and the view from its window was of those steep, intractable hills, a view which changed almost too little, Carfax once or twice thought, remembering his struggles to paint it. His love and sleep that night were less than ever troubled by memories of his former bedroom, whereat his last glimpse had offered little but peaceful sunshine. Next day she wrote again, but not the day after. The daily habit was broken and henceforth maintained on only perhaps 2 days out of 3. Carfax, balked of his picture, had taken up work in the music room, where he occupied himself setting some poems written by Ariel herself. Sometimes she would sing the songs to him in the evening. Later he began a larger choral work with words drawn from Bedoues, a handsome hand-printed edition of whose writings he had found in Ariel's library. This composition he seemed never able to complete, but immediately he had started it, he had become aware of a sudden change in his estimate of the earlier songs. Previously he had considered them, especially when sung in Ariel's cello contralto, as the best music he had written. But as soon as he had completed a single day's work on Bedoues, they had seemed to him quite worthless. In the end, he felt seriously ashamed of them, and was deterred from actually destroying them only by the fear that Ariel would ask once more to sing them, and expose him to the necessity of embarrassingly explaining artistic incompetence and self-derogation. This, however, she never did. Days and weeks passed, without incident seeming to Carfax in any way remarkable, save for its content of beauty and happiness. He had put away the songs in his suitcase, and his struggles with Bedoues, though somewhat unrewarded, were not unpleasurable. Most else that happened was almost pure joy. Once he reflected that his mortification about the songs alone exempted him from that doomed perfection of happiness Ariel had spoken of. He saw the songs as correspondent to the flaw reputedly introduced on purpose by the Chinese into their otherwise perfect works, in the hope of thus diverting the envy of heaven. He mentioned this possibility to Ariel. "Flaws, my dearest," she answered, "are your delight. I shall dress tonight in odd stockings, to put your mind at rest." So that evening his dinner was shared by a beautiful court fool, with whom he pleasantly argued whether Puck or Oberon or Prospero's Ariel or even Feste should be played by a man or a woman. One day, when she was out riding, he came upon a book he had noticed her reading. Lying spine upwards on a chair, it brought back to his mind the volume of Voltaire held open by her fingers when first he saw her. He found the book to be Dallmeier's collection of Judeo-Arabic fables. It was in German, a language he had studied for Foreign Office purposes, but, like all the other subjects he had mastered for that reason, had never since used. His German was now, accordingly, somewhat piecemeal, and the book, moreover, was made no easier for the unaccustomed by being printed in Gothic script. Nonetheless, Carfax began to translate to himself one or two of the fables picked either at random or for their brevity. The first, so far as he could make out, told of a youth who, on being offered by a sage alternative gifts of wisdom, wealth, or virtue, the gifts losing nothing of impressiveness by their Teutonic initial capitals, selected wealth. The sage thereupon remarked that the choice proved the youth already had wisdom, as he would now be able to afford virtue. Carfax found some trouble in translating the abstract words accurately enough to discern the writer's meaning, but he embarked upon a second fable, which seemed to tell of a youth presented by an afrit, or perhaps the German word did not imply anything so malevolent, with a book of the kind which is read by winding the manuscript from a roller held in the left hand onto a roller held in the right hand. The afrit, if that is what the creature was, explained that whenever the youth felt unhappy or bored, he had only to wind the book, which represented his life, a little faster from one roller to the other, and the time would soon pass. Apparently, and as far as Carfax could make out, the manuscript, left alone, would wind itself at the normal pace of the youth's life. Apparently, also, the youth was not granted the power of protracting moments of bliss by retarding the winding process. The fable went on to describe at some length the youth's life, how he longed for time to pass so that he could be a man, could end his weekly day of fasting, could be with his newest mistress, could hold high office, could be rid of a disease or a duty. And at the end of a life of normal span, he proved to have lived for just 3 months and 17 days. The third fable Carfax embarked upon seemed to describe the pleasurable but dangerous activities among a group of warriors of some visitor from another world. This tale contained a number of words completely strange to Carfax. He suspected that no ordinary dictionary would contain them, which, together with the general difficulty the language caused him, and the presence of occasionally apprehended suggestions that the narrative might be of exceptional interest, led him to race down the lines, taking in less and less of the sense the faster he read. Soon he realized that the point was altogether lost, so that further progress, at least without a reference book, seemed futile. After examining the binding and the last page, some kind of moral, apparently, he laid the book down as he had found it. Settling to work upon Bedoues, he found, as he had done before, his mind always a little distracted by the frequency with which that poet seemed to echo his own thoughts and experiences, and particularly thoughts and experiences of which Ariel was at the center. He remembered the case of the armor on the staircase, and 100 other constantly recurring incidents. The profound and unvarying parallelism between external and internal experience began to seem almost a little morbid. Was he obsessed? With Ariel? Or with what else? Was there not a disease of the mind, which rendered the sufferer, as in childhood, unable to distinguish between subject and object? Was he receiving hints of his own unbalance? Did that possibly explain much? The hand which had been lying on the keyboard stopped playing, and he realized that he had been striking the same chord again and again. He sat back and reflected. He was not seriously concerned. He did not really believe he was mad. Certainly not that his more extravagant experiences since he came to Fleet could be thus explained. He had been very disturbed in mind for several years, quite sufficiently so, he thought, to account for symptoms so minor as those now under immediate consideration, though, on the other hand, hardly more so, perhaps, than almost all his neighbors at home. Ariel, however, had always seemed peculiarly unable to grasp even the existence or occurrence of various things and happenings which had disturbed him profoundly. At first, he had thought her unwilling, for some reason of her own, to do so. Now he believed her truly unable. He had on one occasion taken her to the room with the view, and their ideas of what lay visible from the window seemed irreconcilable and deeply disconcerting to both of them. Now he began to wonder whether even the room they were in had seemed alike to them. More and more, when occasionally he tried to bring their experiences into harmony, or taxed her with enquiries, She seemed truly puzzled as well as merely anxious to comfort an exhausted but much loved mind. All this, and particularly the outrageous nature of the occurrences themselves, did indeed suggest the possibility of real madness. In one of them, he suddenly thought, he had tried tentative enquiries of the servants, but experienced such difficulty in making his perplexity understood by them that the experiment had proved unavailing. Being used, however, to finding it difficult to communicate with servants, he had not deemed the failure especially notable. When with Ariel, it came more and more to seem as if in some respects she lived in a world of alien experiences from his, and was herself only slowly coming to realize the fact. Carfax thought of the colorblind who never find out their idiosyncrasy, of the man who only when adult discovered that one eye had lacked sight since birth. The possibility of complete, ultimate harmony between Ariel and him seemed for a moment to suggest some almost sinister opportunities. He then thought of Ariel's beauty, kindness, varied accomplishments, and apparent deep happiness. If their psyches differed in certain profound and essential respects, she was beyond doubt the favored one. Might it not be that he was offered, perhaps alone among his unhappy fellow islanders, a wonderful chance of fulfillment? If so, it seemed clear enough that the gift must be taken with some faith, and not overmuch investigation. "Faith!" he exclaimed aloud, as he set himself once more towards Bedoues. "What's wrong with that?" said a familiar echo. "Provided, of course, that love is also present." She had returned and come straight to him in her riding costume. He appeared to have been meditating about things for longer than he had supposed. Although, when he first came to Fleet, Ariel had spoken enthusiastically of the joys of tramping the island, Carfax, when he almost immediately afterwards became fully aware of the mystery of the view, had, he now realized, unconsciously resolved that to leave the domain might be unwise, inimical, he increasingly felt, to his intense but rather precarious happiness. He had never done so, nor had Ariel again made the suggestion. When, therefore, that evening after dinner, she proposed a walk down to the sea, he was concerned. "Are we not afraid?" "The island loves us." "Your island seems different from mine." "Perhaps that is because we have never made its acquaintance together." They walked down the lanes which edged the yellow drive, through the gates, and along a faint, rough track to the cliffs, hand in hand, and quite silent. It was now summer. The air seemed warm and cool at the same time, as can only be on small islands. There was no wind, and the unpolluted sea lapped and rattled its fetters and spoke in words just unintelligible. They stood on the very cliff edge. Carfax interrupted the silence and the sea with a quotation from Dover Beach. "Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain, and we are here, as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarums of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." She put her arms round him and kissed him. The kiss remained always with him, an agony in the mind, for then the two of them at last met and recognized one another. Later, he supposed that this was indeed a moment's perfect happiness for him, but at the same time the thought did not occur. Everything but the sea was dark and quiet and timeless. Thought and feeling had stopped, and they were immortal. The moment was immortal. They returned after a while to the house, hand in hand and quite silent, and as their love had begun a little before a quotation, so it ended a little after one, for during the night Carfax, by chance or otherwise, woke from the deep, happy sleep into which, retiring unusually early, they had both fallen after their walk, to find himself alone. He saw it, cried out, and listened. All seemed still in the dark house as he opened the door of Ariel's bedroom and cried, "Ariel! Ariel!" The volume and precision of the echo rising round those light syllables startled him, and briefly directed his attention away from another mystery that seemed now to be besieging his mind. He groped at once for a light and a key to this new strange impression following Ariel's disappearance. Then, very distant and not loud, he heard several knocks, as upon a door. He heard what seemed to be the front door of the house opening and closing, and then he thought, quick, hushed footsteps on the lovely crisp gravel of the drive. But all these experiences threw an odd filter of distortion, distance, and unreality, as in some half-waking dreams. He plunged about the mysteriously planned, difficult house, seeking a window which overlooked the drive. All the while he cried, "Ariel! Ariel!" The other sounds had ceased now, with a finality somehow suggestive of time rather than distance, or of the two mingled, as when a half-dream is lost at full waking. In the end he realized what else was wrong. He was in a different house. He knew at once what house it was, and went to his former bedroom, the unexpectedly conventional room with the red-blue wallpaper and the brass bed, rather French and ornate, in which he had never slept. As he opened the door, light poured in through the window, and a breeze blew out his candle. Looking out at the view for the first time, Carfax saw spread before him on all sides a large town. Sky signs were still flashing and flickering. Many of the houses still had lights in the windows, even at that late or early hour. A vague miscellany of noises reached Carfax's ear, for months unaccustomed to the urban pandemonium or garland of sound. A forgotten but unmistakable odor of humanity drifted in on the midnight air. From that smell, Fleet had seemed unchallengeably free. As it reached his senses, Carfax knew that he was once more in bondage, irrevocably. A wild, bitter misery at his utter loss descended upon him, and clung like the shroud about a man who has been hanged. Never afterwards would he for one waking moment be free from the desperate, devouring, damned memory of the beautiful creature he had known. He would dream he was with her still or again, and wake to resume his life among strangers. He was past tears, past hope, past appetite, past all but bitter despair at his unequaled loss. He was alone, and all the foolish, bad, unlovely world were strangers. The house was empty and derelict. His possessions proved, when he had closed the window and relighted the candle, to be ranged about the shattered room. He packed and left, and walked into the noisy town, still thronged with drunken holiday-makers. He noticed by the gate an estate agent's bill with "Sold" affixed diagonally across it in red letters. Doubtless the house was to be pulled down to make room for villas, or perhaps it was to become a private hotel or private school or private asylum. Fleet had at some time been rebuilt on a new site, as Ariel had said. perhaps by some rebellious second son who, inheriting unexpectedly, had seized the chance ruthlessly to make effective his long-standing distaste for the old hidden spot, a spot so hidden that the house seemed almost unborn into time. To that son, no doubt, it seemed unadventurous, unprogressive. Doubtless, research at the public library would clear this matter up, but Carfax omitted to go to the public library. He took the last bus into the capital. He was one of 3 or 4 standing passengers, and, seeing the suitcase he held, a boy rose and offered his seat. Looking for the fare, Carfax drew from his pocket a little paper spill which he remembered having found among the pages of Bedoues, where presumably some reader had used it as a bookmark. Sick at heart, he paid his fare and unrolled the spill. On the inside was written, in Ariel's bewitching hand, all freedom and grace, a silly little doggerel verse. There's nothing in why, the question is how. Whatever you learnt from the golden bough. It was to be supposed that Sir James Fraser's book was in the writer's mind, but there were no capitals. Carfax sank into a motionless misery. It was only when he entered his room in the big hotel, where he spent the rest of the night, that the significance struck him of the boy's action on the bus. Before him in the wardrobe mirror as he entered stood an old man, and a few simple tests sufficed to prove the old man to be himself. He had not slumbered away the years like Rip Van Winkle in his mountains, but in 3 months or so he had grown very old. Next day he took the first boat back to England. Among the huge uniform mass of visitors pushing and thronging the quay now that it was summer, he thought for one moment, as, crowded in on the boat's deck, he glanced up from his unending stupor of misery, that he detected a familiar figure, unusually huge and formidable, standing out one instant in the milling swarm. But recently he had many times caught himself in the act of fancying absurd resemblances, making quite false identifications.